True Midnight Encounter, Episode 01. 10 True Camping Encounters That Still Keep Me Up at Night. Vol. Number 1. The forest doesn't feel dangerous during the day. Trees stand still. Birds make noise. The wind explains itself. But after midnight, the forest changes. Sounds disappear. Distance stops making sense, and sometimes something out there realizes you're not supposed to be there. It's not always a growl, not always a scream, not even always a shape you can point to. Sometimes it's smaller than that. A silence that arrives too quickly. A footstep that stops when you stop breathing. A voice that sounds almost right but not quite. A zipper that moves as if someone is learning how it works. These are 10 true camping encounters. Stories told by people who swear they experienced something in the woods that night. Encounters that didn't end when the trip was over. Encounters that followed them into normal life, into bright kitchens and busy highways and crowded grocery stores. Because once you've felt it, you don't forget. The woods can be beautiful. The woods can be calm. But after midnight, the woods can also feel like a room with the lights off, and you are not alone in it. None of the people in these stories were looking for trouble. They weren't chasing legends. They weren't hunting monsters. They weren't filming a documentary. They weren't trying to become a story. They were campers, friends, families, people with coolers and sleeping bags and cheap flashlights from a gas station. People who believed the wilderness was empty. They were wrong. And maybe that's the worst part. Not that something is out there, but that so many of us live our whole lives believing it isn't. Until the night we pitch a tent, close our eyes and hear something breathe on the other side of thin fabric. Story number 1 starts the way a lot of camping stories start, with confidence and a campfire and the assumption that the dark is just the absence of light. Story 1. The night the forest went silent. They had been hiking all day, 4 friends, late 20s. They weren't amateurs. They knew how to pack, how to filter water, how to keep a fire low. They had camped enough times to think they understood the rules. And that's what gets people. The woods don't punish you for being inexperienced. They punish you for being certain. By the time they finished setting up camp, the sun had already disappeared behind the trees. The sky was a bruised purple, the kind that makes everything look like it's underwater. Their campsite wasn't official, just a flat patch off trail, a place they'd found by walking until they stopped hearing other people. They made a small fire. They ate. They laughed. They talked about work and relationships and the kind of plans people make when they still believe tomorrow is guaranteed. The first few hours felt normal. Crickets chirped in a steady pattern. Wind moved through the branches. Somewhere far off, something large walked through brush. Probably a deer, maybe an elk. Then, at 12:11 a.m., everything stopped. Not gradually, not naturally. The forest went silent. No insects, no wind, no movement. It wasn't the kind of quiet you get when things calm down. It was the kind of quiet you get when everything is listening. One of them laughed nervously. Because laughter is what people do when they don't know what else to do. "Okay," he said, trying to make it sound like a joke. "That's not normal." The fire popped. A single ember rose and died. And that's when they heard it. A slow, dragging sound moving through the trees. Not footsteps, not branches snapping. Something heavy, being pulled. At first they couldn't tell where it was coming from. Sound does strange things at night. It bounces, it stretches, it lies. But the dragging kept going, slow and deliberate, and soon they realized it's something that made their stomachs tighten. It was circling them. not crashing through brush, not wandering, not passing by, circling. One full loop, maybe 40 yards out. Then closer again. They stopped talking, they stopped shifting their weight. One of them slowly reached for his headlamp, but didn't turn it on, because the thought occurred to all of them at the same time. Whatever that was, it knew where they were. It wanted them to know it was there. The dragging stopped behind the largest tent. Nobody moved. The silence, that horrible switch-flipped silence, pressed down on them so hard it felt physical. Their ears rang. Then, from just beyond the firelight, a voice spoke. "Hey!" It sounded human, almost. It had the right shape, the right softness. But there was something off about it, like a recording played at the wrong speed. No one answered. The voice tried again, closer this time. "Hey, you guys awake?" Still no response. The firelight flickered, and for a second one of them thought he saw something pale between the trees. A shoulder, a face, a piece of something. Then the light shifted and it was gone. The dragging started again, but different now, not circling, not roaming, just moving slow around the tents, like it was measuring. One friend mouthed, "What is that?" but no sound came out. The voice returned a third time, and this time it used a name, one of their names, quietly, confidently, as if it had always known. The friend whose name was spoken went rigid. His eyes went wide and wet. He shook his head like he was trying to deny his own existence. Nobody slept. They sat with their backs against each other until the sky started to lighten, until the black became gray and the trees became trees again. When the sun finally pushed through, they moved as one. They didn't speak. They didn't even look at each other. They just started packing. That's when they saw the ground. Deep gouges in the dirt surrounding the camp. Not random scratches, not animal tracks, a wide circle, almost perfect, as if something had been dragged around them over and over, carving a boundary. And inside the circle, near the back of the tent where the dragging had stopped, a single impression in the soil, like something had knelt there, like it had been watching them through the fabric. They packed up immediately, left food behind, left gear behind. Didn't care, they didn't discuss it on the hike out. They didn't laugh it off later. They didn't turn it into a funny story, because the moment you do that, you give it a place in your life. And none of them wanted to do that. None of them have camped since. Story 2. It knew my name. This happened to a man camping alone in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. He liked solo trips, said the isolation helped him think. He wasn't reckless. He had maps, backup batteries, an emergency radio. He had done this before. He had always come back. That's how he framed it later. As if the fact that he had survived other trips meant this one should have been safe. He drove out late after work because he wanted to wake up in the woods. He parked at a trailhead and hiked a couple miles in, far enough that he couldn't see the road, far enough that the dark felt complete. He set up his tent in a small clearing, not open enough to feel exposed, not closed enough to feel trapped. He told himself it was a good spot. The first night passed quietly. Owls, insects, a distant rustle now and then. Normal. The second night felt different from the moment the sun went down. The air was heavier, not warmer or colder, just heavier, like the forest had grown denser while he wasn't looking. He cooked a simple meal, put out his fire, crawled into the tent. He fell asleep fast. Then he woke up. No dream, no reason. Just that instinctive snap of awareness, the one animals have, the one people pretend they don't. He checked his phone. 1:30 a.m., outside the tent, he heard footsteps. Slow. Careful, not stumbling, not wandering, approaching. His first thought was animal. A curious bear. A deer moving through the clearing. Something sniffing for food. But the footsteps didn't sound like paws. They sounded like weight shifting from heel to toe. Human. He held his breath and listened. The steps stopped, just a few feet from the tent wall. Silence. Then a voice spoke. Ethan. His name, clear, correct. His blood went cold so fast he felt dizzy. No one knew where he was. He hadn't posted about the trip. He hadn't told coworkers. He had been vague, even with family. And yet there it was. His name, spoken from the dark, as casually as if someone had found him at a party. He didn't answer. The voice waited, patient. Then it tried again, different. Soon. Like it was practicing. As if it had heard the name once, somewhere, and was teaching itself how to shape it. He felt the urge to speak, to demand who was there to claim authority over the darkness. But something held him back. A memory, maybe. All the stories you've ever heard about not responding to voices in the woods, all the warnings people laugh at until they're alone and it's 1:30 a.m. He stayed silent. Something pressed gently against the side of the tent, not hard enough to tear the fabric, not even hard enough to leave a mark, just enough to let him know it was there. The tent wall indented inward slowly, like a palm testing a surface. He could see the shape through the nylon, a shadow of a hand. Except it wasn't right. It was too long. The fingers, or whatever they were, didn't end where fingers should end. They kept going, faintly tapered, as if whoever made them had learned hands from a picture and gotten the proportions wrong. The pressure lifted. A pause, then the voice, closer. Ethan. This time it was softer, more accurate, more confident, like it was getting better. He squeezed his eyes shut, as if that could make him invisible. He reached for his knife. Not because he thought it would help, but because he needed to feel something solid in his hand. The footsteps moved again, slowly, circling the tent. He tracked them by sound, by the faint shift of weight in leaves. He could tell when they stopped. He could tell when they leaned in. At one point, the tent wall brushed against something as if a shoulder had pressed into it. He could smell it then. Not animal, not sweat. Something like wet bark, something like soil after rain, something old and damp and wrong. The voice spoke again. Not his name this time, a question. Where's the other one? He didn't understand. There was no other one, unless it meant someone else. Unless it thought people always came in pairs. Unless it was looking for something it had seen before. He held his breath until his chest burned. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The footsteps retreated, careful and steady, disappearing into the trees. He lay frozen for a long time after, too afraid to move, too afraid to even exhale fully in case the sound would bring it back. When morning finally arrived, he waited until the light was strong enough to make the clearing look ordinary. Then he unzipped the tent. He stepped out, expecting to see tracks, expecting to see torn ground, snapped branches, proof. There were no tracks, no footprints, no paw prints, nothing. But there was one thing carved into a nearby tree at eye level, fresh and pale against dark bark. His name, misspelled, as if it had learned the sound first. and only later tried to learn the letters. He didn't pack neatly. He didn't finish breakfast. He shoved his gear into his bag, left the fire pit uncleaned, did everything wrong. Because rules don't matter when you feel like you've been claimed. On the hike back, he kept thinking about the voice, how close it had been, how calm it had sounded, how it had said his name like it belonged to it. He hasn't camped alone since, and even now, years later, he says there's one thing he cannot stand: hearing his name spoken in the dark. Story 3. The Whistling Man. 3 college students camping near a river in Colorado. Late summer. A campfire. Drinking. They weren't deep in the backcountry. They weren't lost. They were close enough to a trail that another group could have wandered past. That was the comfort they held on to. The idea that the woods still had rules. They set up camp near the water because it felt peaceful. Because the sound of the river made the dark feel less empty. They cooked. They joked. They told the kind of scary stories people tell when they still feel safe. Around midnight, they started hearing whistling. At first, they thought it was another group nearby, someone being annoying, someone trying to get a laugh. But the whistling had no melody. It wasn't a tune. It wasn't a song. It was broken, random, wrong. A few sharp notes, a pause, then a different set of notes. Like someone was testing what whistling was supposed to sound like. They looked at each other and smiled, uneasy. One of them called out, "Hey, you guys camping near us?" No response. The whistling continued, and it kept getting closer. They shined flashlights into the trees. Nothing. Just trunks and shadows, and the beam of light dying in darkness. They tried to laugh it off. They tried to return to their conversation. But every time they spoke, the whistling paused, as if listening, as if waiting for them to stop. One of them stood up to pee, walked a few steps away with his flashlight. The whistling changed immediately, shifting direction, following. He came back fast, zippering up his jacket like it was suddenly colder. "It's right there," he whispered. "I can hear it." He pointed toward the trees. They all listened. The whistling was closer now, maybe 20 yards away, and it wasn't moving randomly anymore. It was circling. They tried to spot movement, a silhouette, anything. Nothing. Then the whistling stopped. Silence. The river kept flowing, steady, indifferent. One of them let out a breath and said, "Okay, that's enough. Funny joke." A moment passed. Then the whistling started again. Behind them, from the river. They turned so fast they almost fell. The sound was coming from the water line, from the rocks, from the darkness where the river widened and deepened. But they couldn't see anyone. One of them yelled, voice sharper now, "Who's there?" The whistling stopped again. A splash echoed through the darkness. Not a fish, not a small animal, a heavy splash, the sound of something large stepping into shallow water. Then bare feet, slapping against wet rocks, running toward them, fast. They froze for half a second because the brain does that. It tries to make sense. It tries to decide if panic is justified. Then the running got closer and closer, and they understood. They ran. They left their gear. They left their food. They left their phones in the tent. They ran like animals. They didn't look back until they reached the trailhead, until they found their car, until they were inside with the doors locked. Even then, they sat in silence, breathing hard, listening. One of them finally whispered, "Did you see it?" Nobody answered because nobody wanted to admit the truth. They hadn't seen anything. They had only heard it. And somehow that was worse. They went back the next day with a ranger. Their campsite was untouched. Tents still standing. Cooler still there. Food still in wrappers. No signs of a struggle. No torn fabric. No footprints around the fire. Nothing. The ranger asked where they had heard the whistling. They pointed to the river. He walked down, looked around, shrugged. Could have been another camper, he said, but his voice didn't sound sure. Then one of the students noticed the sand. Fresh footprints along the riverbank. Bare, large, too long. The toes were wrong. Too spread out, as if whatever made them wasn't used to feet. The ranger stared, longer than he should have. Then he stood up and said, "Pack your stuff. We're leaving." They left. And on the drive home, one of them realized something. He tried to whistle, just to break the tension. He couldn't. The sound caught in his throat because every time he pursed his lips, his brain flashed back to the river, to the rocks, to bare feet slapping toward them in the dark, and he didn't want to make any sound that might answer back. Story 4. Something was mimicking us. 5 friends camping deep in Oregon's forest. This was one of those trips people plan to feel alive. A break from phones. A break from cities. And they drove for hours, crossed into thicker wilderness, found a spot far from roads, far from other campsites. They set up late afternoon. They joked about horror movies, about how people in those movies always make dumb choices. They told themselves they wouldn't. That night they built a fire and sat close, watching sparks rise into black sky. It started small. One of them laughed at a joke. A second later, from somewhere in the trees came another laugh. Not an echo. Not the same laugh reflected, a different laugh, but shaped similarly. A little flatter, a little delayed. They paused, looked around. The friend who laughed first laughed again, just to test it. A few seconds later, the forest laughed back again. Same timing, same strange delay. They all got quiet. One of them said, "Probably another campsite," even though they knew they hadn't seen any. They shrugged it off the way people shrug off what they can't explain. Later, one of them coughed. A normal cough, the kind that happens when smoke gets in your throat. A few seconds later, the same cough came from the darkness. Same pitch, same rhythm. That made the group stiffen. Because laughter could be human, a cough could be human. But no one had responded when they called out. They tried again. "Hey," one of them shouted, forcing confidence. You guys okay out there?" Silence. Then from the trees, a sound. Not a cough. A throat clearing, like someone preparing to speak. They sat frozen, watching the fire, not wanting to turn their backs to the darkness. One friend whispered, "Stop making noise." So they did. They stopped talking. Stopped laughing. Stopped shifting their feet. They tried to become invisible, but the forest didn't stop. Branches snapped. Not far away, not deep in the woods, close. Footsteps circled the tents, slow and measured, moving just beyond the firelight. Always in the blind spot where you want to look but don't want to see. They sat shoulder to shoulder, pretending they weren't afraid. Then a voice spoke, in the exact voice of one of their friends. "Hey," it said, "come help me with something." The friend whose voice it was felt his face drain. He swallowed hard, because he was sitting right there. And he had not spoken. All 5 of them were by the fire. Nobody moved. Nobody answered. The voice repeated the sentence. Same words, same tone. But this time there was an edge, an impatience. "Hey, come help me with something." The friend whose voice it was began to shake. He whispered, "That's not me." The others nodded, but the nods looked like denial. The voice tried again, angrier, closer. "Come help me." Then the sound changed. The voice, still copying, still perfect, dropped into something else. A thin, strained attempt at crying, a whimper, a sob, like it had learned that crying brings people closer, like it was trying a different tool. One of the friends covered her mouth with both hands to stop herself from making noise. The footsteps circled again. A twig snapped so close they all flinched. The fire crackled and the shadows jumped. For a second they all felt certain they were about to see something step into the light. But nothing came. The voice stopped. Silence returned, except for the fire. They didn't sleep. They sat until morning, backs against each other, eyes burning from staring into dark. When the sun rose, they packed up fast. On their way out, one of them tried to joke, tried to break the tension. He laughed. And from the woods behind them, a second laugh answered. Delayed, flattened, practiced. They didn't laugh again. Even now, years later, they say the worst part isn't that something mimicked them. It's the thought behind it. The idea that whatever was out there was learning, listening, trying to figure out which sound would make them step into the trees. Story 5. The Thing Outside the Tent, a Solo Camper in the Utah Desert. Desert camping is different. There are fewer trees, fewer shadows, fewer places for things to hide. That's what he told himself. He picked a remote spot, flat and open, where he could see in every direction. He wanted the stars. He wanted silence. He got it. The first part of the night was peaceful. The sky was huge. The air was cold but dry, the kind that makes your lungs feel clean. He sat by a small fire and watched the darkness beyond the light. The desert at night feels like standing at the edge of an ocean. You can't see what's out there. You just know it's vast. He went to sleep early, then around 2 a.m., he woke up. Again, no dream, no reason, just that sudden sharp awareness. He listened. At first he heard nothing, then he heard breathing. Not snoring, not panting. Controlled breathing right outside his tent. Close enough that he could hear the slight wetness in it. Close enough to hear the pause between inhale and exhale. He froze. He told himself it was an animal. A coyote sniffing around. A curious dog. But animals don't breathe like that. Animals don't stand still and breathe carefully as if trying not to be heard. Then the fabric of the tent pressed inward, released, pressed again. Slow, deliberate, like fingers testing resistance. He could see the silhouette, faint, through the nylon, a hand shape. But the shape was wrong. Not because it was monstrous, because it looked like it was trying to be a hand and failing. The fingers were too thin, the palm too long. It pressed again, slightly lower, like it was searching for the zipper. He reached for his knife. Not because he thought he'd fight it, but because holding something sharp made him feel less helpless. The breathing continued. Slow. Measured. Then the fabric pressed inward once more, and he felt the tent wall brush his cheek. The contact was so light, so intimate, that it made his skin crawl. He didn't scream, didn't speak. He didn't unzip the tent. He didn't do what so many people do in movies, because something in him understood. The tent was the only barrier between him and whatever was out there, and as thin as it was still something. He held the knife and stayed still. Minutes passed. The breathing stopped. Silence. Then slowly, footsteps. Not walking away fast, not fleeing, just stepping back as if satisfied. He lay there for a long time, waiting for it to return. Eventually dawn came. He unzipped the tent cautiously, expecting to see tracks, claw marks, proof. The sand around his tent was disturbed. Handprints. Not paw prints. Handprints. Too many. As if whatever it was had placed both hands on the ground and leaned close. He counted the finger impressions. There were more than 5 on one hand. He stared until his stomach twisted. Then he noticed something else. The handprints weren't placed like a human crouching. They were placed like something that had been standing, leaning down, tall. He packed up fast, the way people pack when they're trying not to panic. As he walked back to his car, the sun rose behind him, and he felt something he couldn't explain. Not like he was being followed, like he was being watched from far away. He turned around once, scanning the open desert. Nothing, just sand and rock and light. But the feeling didn't leave. Not that day, not ever. Because when something touches the outside of your tent at 2 a.m, and you feel it through fabric, you realize a truth that doesn't fade. You are never as protected as you think you are. Story 6. We followed the wrong trail, a family camping trip. Parents, 2 kids. This wasn't some extreme backcountry expedition. This was supposed to be simple. A campground, bathrooms, other families. The kind of place where you hear laughter and see lanterns glowing through trees. They arrived in the afternoon, set up their tent, cooked hot dogs. The kids roasted marshmallows and complained about smoke. Everything was normal. That's what makes this story difficult to shake. Because it didn't start in danger. It started in comfort. Before sunset, they decided to take a short hike. Just a loop trail, they thought. Something to burn energy before bedtime. They followed the posted signs. A wooden marker pointed left. The trail looked clear. They walked. The kids ran ahead, weaving between trees, stopping to pick up sticks and stones. The parents called them back, smiling, relaxed. After 20 minutes, the trail stretched longer than expected. The mother said, "Maybe we missed the loop." The father checked his phone for a map. No signal. They shrugged. Campgrounds often have bad reception. Then they noticed something. There were no trail markers anymore, no painted blazes on trees, no signs nailed to posts, nothing. The path under their feet was still there, but it felt less intentional. More like an animal trail. More like it was being made by walking, not maintained. The air grew strangely still. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed to stop. The father slowed, his relaxed posture tightening. He said, "Okay, we turn around." The kids protested. He didn't argue. They turned back. They walked. But the trail didn't feel the same. The turns looked unfamiliar. The trees looked wrong, as if the forest had rearranged itself. They walked faster. Then the father stopped. The path behind them was gone, not hidden, gone, replaced by dense trees and underbrush. The mother's face tightened, the way it does when panic is trying to surface. The kids asked what was happening. The father forced calm. "Trail's overgrown," he said, though even he didn't believe it. He pulled out his GPS device, the one he kept for emergencies. No signal, no satellites, nothing. In a campground, in a place that should have been simple. They called out, hoping another hiker would respond. No response. The stillness felt like pressure. The father tried to pick a direction based on the sun, but the canopy blocked light. He tried to remember the shape of the trail, but memory failed him. They walked for what felt like an hour. The kids grew quiet. Even children know when something is wrong. At one point, the youngest said, "Dad, I think we're going in circles." The father didn't answer. He was sweating now. The forest around them looked the same from every angle. Then, suddenly, they saw something ahead. A clearing. A familiar shape. The campground. They stumbled into it like they'd been released. The father almost laughed from relief. The mother hugged the kids too tightly. They returned to their tent and packed up, despite the kids crying that they didn't want to leave. The father went to the ranger station. He described what happened. The trail marker. The missing signs. The vanished path. The ranger listened quietly. Then he frowned. "There is no trail in that direction," he said. The father argued. He insisted they'd followed a sign. The ranger pulled out a map. He pointed. "That path was closed decades ago," he said. "It doesn't exist anymore. We removed the markers." The father's stomach dropped. Because he remembered the marker clearly. He remembered the arrow pointing left. And he remembered something else now. The wood of the marker had looked older than the others. Weathered. Like it had been there longer than it should have been. They left that night. And on the drive home, the mother asked the father what he thought happened. He didn't answer at first. Then he said quietly, "I think we followed the wrong sign." She said, "How can a sign be wrong?" He gripped the wheel tighter, and he said, "I don't know." He hasn't taken his kids hiking since. Not because he thinks the woods are evil, but because he learned something he cannot unlearn. Sometimes in the forest, you can follow what looks like a path, and it will take you somewhere you were never meant to go. Story 7. The Man Who Wouldn't Answer. Two brothers fishing late at night. They were camping near a lake, the kind that looks like black glass at night. They had spent the day hiking, swimming, grilling. By evening, they were tired but happy. After dinner, they decided to fish. They brought headlamps, chairs, a small tackle box. They sat by the water and listened to insects sing. For a while, it was peaceful. Then one brother noticed something across the lake. A figure standing near the far shore, completely still. At first, he assumed it was another camper, someone watching the water. He pointed it out. The other brother squinted and said, "Yeah, that's weird." They watched for a minute. The figure didn't move. No shifting, no turning, no bending to pick something up, just standing. They called out, "Hey!" One brother shouted, "You all right over there?" No response. They laughed nervously. Maybe the person was far enough not to hear. The brother cupped his hands and shouted louder, "Hey, we're just fishing. You good?" Still nothing. The figure remained, dark against darker trees. The brothers tried to return to fishing, but they kept glancing up. The longer they looked, the stranger it felt. The figure wasn't holding a fishing rod, wasn't carrying a light. It was just there, like it had been placed. Minutes passed. Then slowly the figure turned its head, only the head. The body didn't move. The shoulders stayed locked forward, facing the lake. The head rotated to face them. The brothers went still, because even at that distance they could see the face. Pale. Too pale. It looked like a mask catching moonlight. One brother whispered, "Nope." The other didn't disagree. They stood up, grabbed their gear, and began walking back toward camp. They kept their headlamps off, as if light would attract attention, as if being seen would make it real. Halfway back, one brother couldn't help it. He looked over his shoulder. The figure was no longer across the lake. It was closer, not on their side, not yet, but closer along the shore, as if it had moved without them noticing. He swallowed hard. They walked faster. When they reached camp, they didn't sit down, they didn't relax. They climbed into their tent and zipped it shut. Inside in the dark, they listened. For a long time, they heard nothing. Then faintly, from the direction of the lake, a sound. Not footsteps, a slow splash, like something entering shallow water. Then nothing. The next morning, they went to the ranger station. They described what they saw. The motionless figure, the pale face, the head turning without the body. The ranger listened and nodded slowly, like he'd heard other strange stories. Then he asked a question. "Did you see anyone else out there?" They said no. The ranger frowned. "Because you're the only people registered for that section," he said. "There shouldn't be anyone across the lake." The brothers stared at him. The ranger hesitated, then added, "Sometimes people wander in, sometimes people trespass." But his voice lacked conviction. As they left, one brother asked, "Do you believe us?" The ranger didn't answer directly. He said, "If you see something out there again, don't call out to it, just leave." They left that day, and for months afterward, one brother kept thinking about the head turning. How slow it was, how deliberate, as if it had been waiting for them to notice, as if their attention had been the point. Story 8. Something was dragging outside 6 people sleeping in tents. This was a group trip, a weekend escape. They had 2 tents, a big cooler, enough snacks to feed a small army. They weren't deep in wilderness. They were in a forested campground, but far enough from others that they didn't hear neighboring campers. They stayed up late, talking, telling stories, watching the fire burn down. Eventually, they crawled into their tents. The night was cool. The air smelled like pine. They fell asleep. Then they woke up. Not all at once, one at a time. Because the sound was subtle at first, a scraping, a dragging through leaves, heavy, slow, like someone pulling a long object across the ground. One camper sat up, listening. He thought maybe someone was moving firewood, maybe a raccoon knocking something over. Then the sound continued. Not random. It moved in a circle around the campsite. The second camper woke, whispered, "Do you hear that?" The first nodded. They lay still, listening. The dragging passed behind their tent, close enough that the fabric trembled slightly as something moved by. Then it went farther, then closer again, like it was pacing. Minutes passed. The sound did not stop. At some point, the campers realized something that chilled them. It wasn't coming from the road. It wasn't coming from the direction of other campsites. It was coming from the forest. It had been there already. It was not arriving. It was moving around them like it owned the place. One camper reached for his flashlight and turned it on inside the tent, not pointing it out, just using it to see faces. Everyone looked pale. One whispered, "Should we yell?" Another whispered back, "No, don't," because yelling would confirm they were awake. The dragging stopped, right outside their tent. Silence. In the quiet, they could hear breathing, faint and slow. Then a small sound. The zipper. It moved, just slightly. The metal teeth shifted, a soft click, as if something had tugged on the pull tab. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The zipper moved again. A few more millimeters, like fingers learning, like curiosity testing the boundary. One camper had the sudden, irrational thought that it was a bear. That bears can be clever. That bears can open things. But bears are not patient like that. Bears are not delicate. The zipper stopped. Then the dragging began again, slowly moving away. It circled once more, then faded into the forest. They stayed awake until morning. When the sun rose, they came out cautiously. At first, they saw nothing. Then they saw the ground. Long drag marks leading away from the campsite. Deep grooves carved through leaves and dirt, disappearing into the trees. And near the tent, where the zipper had moved, deep impressions in the soil, as if something massive had been resting there, not crouching, resting, like it had taken its time. One camper followed the drag marks a short distance before someone grabbed his arm and said, "No, don't." They packed up fast. On the way out, they passed other campers who smiled and waved. Normal people, normal morning. The group tried to talk about it as if it were a prank, as if the explanation would make the fear go away. But the fear didn't go away, because the zipper had moved. And that meant whatever was out there didn't just wander by. It had intention. It had hands, or something like hands, and it had wanted inside. Story 9. The lights in the trees. Camping near a mountain ridge. Two friends, experienced hikers, the kind who love solitude and altitude. They chose a spot with a view of the valley. During the day it was breathtaking. At night it was a bowl of darkness. They went to sleep early. They woke around 3 a.m. One of them later said it felt like being woken by a stare, like his body sensed attention. He opened his eyes inside the tent and listened. At first, nothing. Then he noticed a faint glow through the fabric. He sat up, unzipped the tent carefully, and looked out. Between the trees, scattered in the darkness, were small lights, blue-white, not like flashlights, not steady beams, more like floating points, as if someone had hung tiny stars in the forest. He stared, confused, then nudged his friend awake. The friend looked out and went silent. The lights were moving, not drifting with wind, not wobbling, moving with purpose. They would pause behind a tree, then slide to the next, then stop again. Watching. The friend whispered, "Fireflies." But it was too cold for fireflies, and these lights weren't flickering, they were steady. One light moved closer. It stopped behind a tree near their campsite. Then slowly it rose. Not up a trunk, up into open air, hovering. The camper's mouth went dry. He raised his flashlight and pointed it toward the light. The moment the beam hit, the light moved. Fast. Not fleeing like an animal, not startled. It darted sideways, vanished behind branches. Then several other lights scattered too, like a school of fish changing direction. The campers lowered the flashlight, stunned. For a moment, the forest was dark again. Then, slowly, one light returned. It hovered near the edge of their clearing, closer than before, almost as if it were curious, almost as if it had learned something from the flashlight. The campers didn't speak. They watched the light hover, motionless, for an unnaturally long time. Then the light shifted slightly, like a head tilt. That's what it felt like, a head tilt, a gesture. The friend whispered, "We leave." The other nodded. They didn't pack carefully. They didn't fold sleeping bags. They didn't break down the tent properly. They shoved gear into bags, hands shaking, eyes glued to the trees. The light remained, watching. As they walked down the trail, headlamps on, they kept glancing back. The light stayed in the forest, floating between trunks, as if they had no interest in chasing, as if they had only wanted to observe. They reached the car before sunrise and drove away. On the road, the friend tried to rationalize. "Maybe someone had drones," he said. "Maybe another group." But neither believed it, because the movement had been wrong. Too quiet, too smooth, too aware. They never found an explanation. And that's the kind of story that crawls into your head at night. Not because it proves anything, but because it leaves a question. If those lights were watching, what were they watching for? Story 10. It followed us home. The trip itself was uneventful. That's what makes the ending so bitter. A group of friends, a casual weekend, no storms, no injuries, no strange noises in the night. They camped, they hiked, they took photos, they laughed. When it was time to leave, they felt that familiar sadness people feel when a trip ends. The bittersweet return to normal life. They packed up, loaded the car, drove out of the forest. At the edge of the trees where the dirt road met pavement, they saw a figure standing near the road. Tall, still. No flashlight, no car nearby. Just a shape against the forest line. The driver slowed instinctively. Someone in the passenger seat whispered, "Do we stop?" The driver shook his head. They passed the figure. As they did, the passenger turned to look, expecting to see a face. He didn't. The figure's head seemed tilted slightly downward, like it wasn't watching them, like it didn't need to. They drove on. No one spoke for a while, because sometimes silence is safer than questions. Miles later, the passenger said quietly, "Did anyone else see that in the mirror?" The driver glanced at the rear view. At first, nothing. Just road. Then something moved. A shape far behind in the center of the lane. Running. Too fast. It wasn't like a person sprinting, not the bobbing rhythm of human legs. It was smooth, like a shadow being pulled forward. The driver's hands tightened on the wheel. He sped up. The shape stayed in the mirror for a moment, keeping pace in a way that didn't make sense. Then it dropped back. Vanished. The car filled with nervous laughter, the kind people use to convince themselves it wasn't real. "It's probably someone messing with us," someone said. But nobody sounded convinced. They reached home. They unloaded gear. They promised to plan another trip soon. Life resumed. Weeks passed. Then one of them began hearing footsteps outside his house at night. Not neighbors, not cars. Footsteps. Dragging. Slow. Deliberate. He told himself it was animals. But animals don't drag their feet. One night he woke to the sound right outside his bedroom window. He lay still, listening. The dragging stopped. Silence, then softly from outside. A voice. Not loud, not clear. Just enough to be heard. "Hey." The same word from story 1, the same casual invitation. He didn't answer. He didn't move. He waited until sunrise. In the morning he checked outside. No tracks, no disturbed grass. Nothing. But on the lower edge of his window in the dust, there was a faint smear, like a hand had touched the glass. He wiped it away. He tried to forget. But the footsteps returned, on and off, for months. Sometimes on the driveway, sometimes on the porch, always after midnight. He never saw a face. He never saw a body. Only the suggestion of something close. And that's the kind of haunting people don't talk about. Not because it's too unbelievable, but because It's too plausible, because you don't need to believe in monsters to understand this. If something learned you once, if something noticed you once, it might not forget. Outrow. Woods. The woods don't feel dangerous in daylight. They feel old, quiet, empty. But after midnight, the forest doesn't just surround you. It watches. Every story you heard tonight started the same way. A campfire, a tent, and the belief that nothing out there was paying attention. So ask yourself this: if the forest went silent around you, if something in the dark said your name, would you trust your instincts? Or would you convince yourself it was nothing until it was too late? If you've ever experienced something strange in the woods, something that made you leave early or never go back, tell us about it in the comments. You're not the only one who's felt watched out there. And if you want to keep exploring the encounters that happen after midnight, stay with us. The forest remembers who steps inside it.